I've said somewhere or other before in this channel that we think in symbols. Even if it's not always conscious, it's always there. And one of the big, very visual symbols in Star Wars is the Death Star. Very much this symbol of the Empire's power and threat. They even talk about it as such.
Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station. No star system will dare oppose the Emperor now.
Which is true in a literal sense because it's this great technological power that can blow up a planet, but also symbolically it's this visual image of the Empire's dominance that just seeing, just knowing it's there would crush your spirit and give you reason for compliance. And in a way it reminds me of the Eye of Sauron, this ever great, looming, all-seeing presence of fear and power, or many great fortresses constructed throughout history, not just as a physical defence, but also as a symbol of power. It was clever as well to make the Death Star visually similar to the moon and kind of remind you of it for that reason, this ever-looming thing to orbit round our lives. The thing is though, that's a bit of a risk, because having this clear symbol of their power and dominance would crush your spirit more than not having one, even though the fear of the unknown is the greater one. Without that symbol there, you can at least have the illusion of feeling free or powerful, or the potential for reaching that. With the symbol there, you're denied that possibility and awareness of the potential. However, there is the risk that the symbol of the Death Star is a clear target. It's something concrete for the rebels to try and destroy. Because it works as this symbol of power, the destruction of it would symbolically then feel like the destruction of the Empire's power altogether, the death of its dominance over the galaxy. Literally and practically that isn't true because the Empire still has huge power and grip, but symbolically the rebels being able to destroy the Death Star would bring such a great wave of hope and momentum, much more than would ever have come about had the Death Star never existed to begin with. So whilst the Empire are still the dominant force at the end of Star Wars Episode 4, symbolically it no longer feels that way. The rebels have momentum. In the Death Star's destruction, much more than in the development of Luke, they've been given a new hope. If it's not obvious, I watched Star Wars 4 again the other day and thought to make a video about some of the symbolism in it, whether intended symbolism or not. There's probably quite a bit, and we know George Lucas was inspired by Joseph Campbell's classic mythic book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, so inspired there's even a George Lucas quote on the blurb of my copy. Not that we are going to go through the whole hero's journey and archetypes thing here, because I suspect that's been done. It's just to point out there is some symbolism and mythic quality to these films, and I wanted to talk generally about some of the symbolism I drew from it, watching this film again for the first time in years, really. Obviously, it's all my own interpretations, as with all my videos, and because Star Wars is so familiar as this fun franchise I grew up watching, it is difficult to think about it artistically, so I suspect there will be lots I've missed and lots of space to add points in the comments. Anyway, I think beginning the film kind of from the focus of C-3PO and R2 is possibly the best way George Lucas could have introduced us to what was a very strange and extraordinary world at the time. It makes this vast, epic fantasy feel grounded throughout its prologue. They bring some simpler comic relief to what could have been a bit heavy and grand. We see them bickering on this ship whilst we're introduced to Darth Vader and all the political stuff, then see them bickering on Tatooine to ease us into this new location before we then get introduced to Luke. I just think it's a good way to set the world without having to spout too much exposition or anything, setting it more tonally rather than practically, I suppose. But symbolically, droids are just very interesting in themselves from the fact they're not human and remind me of the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, who lacks a heart.
No heart?
C-3PO even has some similarities in appearance, and he's an interesting character because he's pure intellect, really. C-3PO is hugely knowledgeable on languages and protocol.
Protocol? Why, it's my primary function, sir.
Very well spoken and mannered, and yet entirely unable to really connect with anyone.
In language to me, I'm as
Alright, shut up, I'll take this one.
Shutting up, sir.
Despite all his grasp of language, he's always ignored or told to shut up, or in R2's case, seen as a nagging voice to just not listen to. And that's a fun, slightly sad idea, really. Intellect without much heart, and also a bit of a people pleaser who's unable to think for himself so much as to follow protocol and avoid all trouble. Although later in this film he does tell a lie to the stormtroopers, so I think there's kind of development there, but I'm certain Double D from Ed, Edd and Eddy was inspired by C-3PO. He kind of lacks his own voice and is instead more of a translator for others, specifically R2, who, in total contrast, doesn't really have an understandable voice for the audience. I mean, whilst C-3PO translates some of his speech for us, or Luke does later on, lots of it is just not given any translation, and we're left with tone to try and judge what he's communicating. I think his way of speech is genius, by the way, how to make him sound inhuman and robotic and without any words, but also quite emotional at the same time.
No, I don't like you either.
But yeah, R2 is without language and yet has more of a voice and impact socially than C-3PO does. He's a character of action. So much so he's the inciting incident for the entire film. He carries Leia's message and I guess then is technically a MacGuffin, but he's also much more than that. Which coincidentally is something said to me by someone the other day, the cycle we get of the fragment of Leia's message playing on repeat as a good analogy or representation for trauma. Unable to quite pass through its completion but getting stuck and so repeating over and over again. That's just a tangent though. C-3PO and R2 make an interesting team in this sense anyway. Knowledge and action, conformity and individualism. The two do come as a pair throughout the franchise really, and so symbolically seem like two sides of a greater whole. R2 may be more obviously positive and impactful of the two, but C-3PO's voice of protocol and moral reasoning can serve to keep R2 in check. I guess droids are interesting if you think of them also as sentient living beings that are treated as a subhuman race to be owned by human masters, which makes the Jawas stealing and selling on droids very much like human trafficking, which is a very dark thought. Despite their obvious sentience, droids are treated as lesser consistently throughout the film, and we have to wonder that if C-3PO and R2 weren't owned by the good guys, with kind Luke as their owner, would R2's brashness have landed him into trouble, where there'd be no place for anything other than C-3PO's more anxious obedience and submissive protocol? I'd imagine that's what's more typically expected of droids. But anyway, I like that Luke's home isn't the wonderful, innocent, sheltered home where through the plot Luke then discovers the world isn't actually so innocent as he thought. It's not that trope. Instead, I guess it's more Joseph Campbell, but it's a very bleak and barren place from the beginning, full of crime where they are buying stolen droids, and there's sand people out there, and Jabba, and just generally a
wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Luke knows all this, he isn't sheltered, and he hates the Empire, and he wants to get away, even if he's also reluctant until his aunt and uncle die, which, he's less torn up about them dying than the death of his guru he's only had a close connection to recently, but still.
If there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
We've got the sense from the very beginning that this is very much an arid wasteland, lacking meaning and justice and life. Spiritually empty and in need of revival, which is a fitting comparison to the ending of the film on the fertile land of Yavin 4 and the original trilogy finishing on Endor. Also fitting is that Uncle Owen is a farmer who is struggling to grow food, symbolically infertile and without creation. Luke feels lost. He knows he wants to get away, he knows he wants to learn about his father and his past and seek meaning there, but it's not something his uncle will talk to him about. Life feels stuck in this impotent state and he doesn't know how to change that. And in contrast to the dusty, tacky, arid, often dark aesthetics of the ordinary people and the rebellion, we get the perfectly clean blankness of the Empire. Like, I know it's the case in every sci-fi film ever, but why are spaceships always so blank and lacking any decoration? Why is it we wouldn't take seriously as an audience a spaceship with, like, wallpaper or ornaments, obviously ones that don't shatter, or landscape paintings or something, they're always so cold and claustrophobic. I want to see a tartan decorated spaceship interior. But you know what I mean, the Millennium Falcon looks tacky and full of character. The Rebel base on Yavin 4 does, and they've got orange coloured pilots with decorations on their helmets, where the Empire are just all black or all white stormtroopers or grey commanders. Darth Vader is an all clean black, where Ben Kenobi wears rugged brown and beige robes.
Hello there.
The blankness symbolically suggests order to the extreme of total rigidity. Barrenness again, but an enforced barrenness. Clean and life-denying order versus the tacky, disordered but nonetheless lively rebellion on Yavin 4. Obviously, life does need its balance between order and disorder, restraint and freedom. However, this film is more the start of the conflict between the two rather than the resolution. Balance to the Force is achieved at the end of episode 6, but even then I think the idea of balance was more George Lucas's vision for the sequels, where despite the Empire's defeat, some sort of system would need to follow its place, and how do we set that up successfully? Obviously that version of the sequels was never made, however. And there's the idea of the Force, which I forgot until watching this back, is talked about here a lot like a weird, ancient, long-dead religion.
Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes.
Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid.
There's something very pagan to it. Perhaps then we can see the Empire versus Rebellion as organised versus non-organised religion? Disorganised? Whatever you call it. Perhaps not, because there is no religious belief to the Empire, but it's certainly one system of control and meaning to be found through strict order, and the other of meaning to be found through a natural flow of life, to letting go rather than seeking control, trusting to instincts and life itself, which we can forget this War of Two Sides is about. It's not just a tyrannical system of government against a rebellion, it's an internal idea of control versus letting go, or maybe something a little like Confucianism versus Taoism, or possibly even a modern rational age versus the less restrained nature and ancient beliefs. That might be a stretch. Obviously, it's the light side of the Force versus the dark side of hatred, but that's not really a theme in this first film. For the moment, it's sort of introducing the Force in general, and, you know, whilst obviously Vader and Palpatine use the Force, the Empire in this film specifically appears more as a system that looks down on the Force as ancient nonsense magic. Vader's use of it here appears like a minority, and it's not until the next films we see differently. So I don't know if George Lucas intended that, or if it was just not wanting to put too much exposition into the first film, but it is interesting. There is naturally a very spiritual feel to the films though, especially when Ben Kenobi dies and returns as a voice in Luke's head, kind of channeling into him, and I think there's a sense of the old generations accepting their end and giving way to the new ones, which is partly what makes the wise old guru such a good trope in general, I think. This sense of something passed down through generations, the old giving way to the new, not in conflict but harmony with it, you know, passing things on and letting them take up the mantle. I guess someone old railing against and trying to suppress the new youth would be the opposite of that, which at a bit of a stretch you can say is Palpatine in contrast to Ben Kenobi or Yoda. Not Vader, however. I'm thinking more about this film solely rather than what we learn of him later or in the prequels or anything, but I think Vader always seems slightly lost, without much motivation, a little bit like a mindless bruiser for the other commanders or Palpatine.
I should have expected to find you holding Vader's leash.
Which I think is what makes his armour... Do you call it armour? What makes his metallic casing perfect symbolically, because he appears as a mindless machine then, bringing us back to the point about a tin man without a heart, this dark, empty being that is a shadow of Luke in many ways, who both killed and is his father, but is also very tragic as a figure with all this power, yet no real freedom. Not until he finally stops to think for himself and question what he really wants at the very end of episode 6. But armour, of course, we can think about generally in terms of a defence against the world, where we symbolically feel such a need to defend and protect ourselves that we end up losing all connection to the outside world beyond those defences. That's Vader too. It's also the stormtroopers and the pilots who are all masked and armoured and blank looking, where the rebels are not. And I guess similar to this point about armour and intimidating aggressive defences is the Death Star itself as this huge, highly powered, absolute tank of the space being defeated by the Millennium Falcon and the tiny little X-Wing. Very much a David and Goliath story for one, but also powerful defences and great fortresses aren't everything. The rebels succeed with ships that are small and much more agile, much freer to move, unencumbered by bulky defences or intimidating power. Sometimes it's actually openness and the freedom it affords us that's the most powerful of things, where our armour and defences can build something of a prism for ourselves. On the flip side of that though, we could see the Millennium Falcon and Han Solo as freedom taken to the extreme, where Han has to be in constant movement, avoiding his debts, fleeing and ducking from the Empire, keeping a distance to everyone really, except Chewie. Han's only real freedom is through his ship and through constant flying and distance, which again is also its own prison in a way. Pre-character development, obviously. On the one hand there's trying to control everything, on the other there's trying to run from everything, and neither are freedom because both are defined by the things you're in conflict with. The path of the Jedi would mean being in acceptance rather than conflict, I suppose. Let me just edit in an extra section to this video actually, because I think I've been more haphazard and probably not as insightful as usual, and I wanted to add a bit more. This is a story not so much about someone innocent growing up, although it partly is. It's more about someone already grown who feels lost and stuck in this symbolic rut, both practically and spiritually barren. Where the world around him might seek meaning through order and arguably technological advances in the New Age, this doesn't ring true for Luke. He seeks meaning instead through the past, both ancestrally in terms of wanting to learn about his elusive father, who Ben Kenobi kind of steps in as a figure or version of, but also through the ancient, faintly pagan ways of the Force. The power of meaning through our ancestry and a felt connection back through generations is often overlooked in our modern world, but it strikes a chord here until, of course, it gets flipped on its head in the next film.
I am your father.
It is, however, the angelic, almost Beatrice-like vision of Leia that first sends him on his path. A vision reached through C-3PO and R2, which ironically are more technological advances, but as I've said, the point isn't this ancient, more freer side of living defeating this modern, more restrained version. It's more about finding the balance between the two and the balance of the Force. But since I seem to have gone weirdly down this line of thinking, you could interpret C-3PO and R2 relaying this vision like the shamanistic combination of inspiration and intellect needed in order to reach beyond into divine visions, but I think that's a stretch too far even for me. Either way though, Leia, via the guidance and training of Ben, sets him off on a quest tinged with ideas of romance at first and all that classic sense of rescuing the princess so that she falls in love with you. Until they discover Leia is no stereotypical damsel in distress, but a badass and a leader, whilst love for Leia and its rivalry with Han may partly be on their minds, Leia guides them both down a path of duty instead, playing their part for the rebellion. Which is what I love about the third act of this film. It turns them from a ragtag crew of misfits who haphazardly save Leia out of luck and improvisation into part of a clear, conscious force, a rebellion army with a carefully planned mission. Whilst Ben Kenobi offered Luke a means to channel his power, Leia offers him direction in that sense. I tend to think about this symbolically like fire and lightning. Fire as this power, but chaotically cast in all directions and a bit all over the place without much vision. But lightning as a consciously aimed strike in a clear direction, where you're then able to channel all of that power down into one straight, precise target. That's what Luke reaches by the end of this film. culminating literally in an aimed strike with his ship firing a precise shot into the Death Star, which explodes and mirrors the destruction of Alderaan. The death of this symbol of fear and power means a wave of new hope for the rebels and some nice medals for Luke and Han, but not Chewie apparently. Luke has found meaning in his past and the Force, unlocking his own inner power combined with clear purpose and direction and a crew of people he belongs with. It's a start, but there's still 2 more films to go. To finish with a few quick review of the film points as well, I'd say episode 4 is one of the best, possibly the best. I'd have to watch the others again first actually. It's a much more contained in its story, and it is literally a hero's journey in space, but for someone who's not necessarily the best writer, though still nowhere near as bad as he often gets panned for, the contained structure probably suits George Lucas quite well. The world is a very interesting one. We see lots of it without it feeling crammed in or breaking the pace of the film. I mean, I know there is literally an exposition dump at the beginning, but I don't think I ever really bothered to read any of them, and that was never a problem. Also, the stylized nature of them somehow makes it kind of forgivable and very nostalgic. But it's a weird world to introduce us to, and yet George Lucas is able to make it seem very familiar. The characters are strong here. Leia is great. This film would have been terrible if she was a weak damsel in distress, but she's not. She's heroic even in capture, and is full of grit and anger, particularly in relation to Han, who is also a great character for his cynical, distant space cowboy feel. A good person who is trying to convince himself he's indifferent. C-3PO and R2, while technically a comic relief trope, also aren't that at all. They're important characters in their own rights with a lot of personality. If anyone's lacking character, you can probably say it's Luke, but it doesn't feel too much of a problem in terms of the structure of this film or how it affects anything. Maybe that's something to talk about more in later videos to do with the later films. I don't know, I'll have to watch them again, we'll see. I like that Luke basically doesn't use a lightsaber at all yet because he hasn't been trained, nor even technically meets Vader, this film's antagonist, or Tarkin either. It's actually quite bold of George Lucas to not do that. We only get one lightsaber fight, and it's a very contained one that Ben Kenobi ends abruptly by accepting death. I think the whole destroying the Death Star scene is genuinely captivating and quite an original idea, just really well filmed, a really great action sequence, and as I said, it's satisfying to see them move from a disordered ragtag crew of misfits to this clear, planned attack. A lot is done to inject good character into potentially cliche scenes in this film, like, for example, C-3PO lamenting how he's got them all killed when he hears them screaming with relief and delight from the garbage chute.
They're dying, R2! Curse my metal body, I wasn't fast enough, it's all my fault!
Or Han and Leia bickering in the middle of trying to escape, or Han shooting the monitor when he fails to bluff his way out of trouble.
We're fine. We're all fine here now, thank you. How are you?
It's all just very fun. Artistically, they're obviously not the greatest films, no. However, all stories carry meaning, whether conscious or not, and there is a very mythic quality to Star Wars that does often get overlooked because of how fun and familiar they are. So much so, I suspect there is a lot I failed to notice here. Anyway, I will continue this series, finishing the original trilogy, then possibly doing the others as well, if you're all keen on it. When I did the Batman video, I asked for 1,500 likes in order to make the sequel, which I'm going to get round to at some point soon, by the way. But I was told that was probably too small an amount of likes to ask for, so 3,000 likes and I'll carry this series on, talking more symbolism, but I'll also probably review the next films a bit more as well than I have done here, and I think talk psychology to do with Luke maybe next time. Anyway, let me know what you think, what I've missed. Subscribe if you want to, support me on Patreon if that's your thing, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. As ever, a special thank you goes to Devin, Darren Brother-Glatter, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Samara Salsi, Sharikov2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.